boys and girls, welcome to Storytime with Nonie and Finnegan. We're on our last chapter in Hind's Feet on High Places. As Much Afraid and her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, continued on their path, leading them to the high places, Much Afraid continued to learn many lessons, and every time she would pick up the rock and put it in her little pouch to remind her of the lessons she had learned. And you know what? Her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, became even better friends. They walked along. It was hardly any work at all walking along with Sorrow and Suffering now. She enjoyed being with them. And then one day, the path led them to the hardest test of all. They arrived at a great big canyon. It was so deep, Much Afraid could not even see the bottom of it. What is this place? Do you know? And Sorrow and Suffering answered very softly, "This is the canyon of full surrender." Full surrender? Much Afraid knew exactly what surrender meant. Surrender meant giving up everything. All along her journey, Much Afraid had been giving little things. Her desires, her will, laying it down on an altar, and picking up what the shepherd wanted her to do rather than what she wanted. But surrender, and especially full surrender, that meant giving up everything. Everything that was most important to her, even the shepherd's promises. She knew she had to be willing to give up the hope of ever reaching the high places, the hope of ever having a mouth that was not crooked and feet that weren't crippled. Oh my goodness, could she do that? Much Afraid sat down on the rock. She was thinking, all these promises, maybe all the shepherd's promises were just not promises at all. Maybe they were just lies, and maybe they would never come true. Much Afraid emptied out the pouch of rocks onto her lap, and one by one she picked up the stones, remembering each lesson she had learned, and each time she had laid down her will for the shepherds. She began to put each one of them back into her pouch. And finally, she said, "I can't throw them away. Even if the shepherd leads me into the canyon of full surrender, I'll choose to follow him." Sorrow and Suffering had been sitting by, quietly waiting to see the decision that Much Afraid was going to make. They laughed with relief because they knew that Much Afraid choosing full surrender was the only thing that was going to allow them to make it to the high places. And so, Much Afraid stood up, and Sorrow and Suffering got up with her, and she looked out over that canyon, and she said, "Well, what do we do now? Can we jump across it?" Sorrow and Suffering said, "No, that would be impossible." And Much Afraid said, "Well, then what are we supposed to do?" Sorrow and Suffering answered together, "Well, we must jump into the canyon." Of course! Jump into the canyon of full surrender! She should have known. Oh, what was the shepherd going to think of next? Then, for the last time on Much Afraid's journey, even though she didn't know it at the time, she reached out to take the hands of her friends, Sorrow and Suffering. Much Afraid was so weak by this time that Sorrow and Suffering came. Instead of taking her hands, they came and picked up her arms and helped her to the edge of the canyon. And then Before they even had a chance to think about it, they jumped into the canyon of full surrender. Much Afraid might have hurt herself had she fallen all on her own, but sorrow and suffering were there to help ease her fall. When they finally opened their eyes, the canyon was very dark. It was filled with fog, and they couldn't see anything at first. And then they stepped forward, carefully feeling their way around. Much Afraid got to a place. It was a big rock structure. And as she was feeling all around it, she realized that it was some sort of altar. And she said to Sorrow and Suffering, "This is the place. This is to be where I give my offering." And this time, Much Afraid climbed up on top of that altar and laid herself down. There came a flame from somewhere up above, and it touched Much Afraid's heart, and she was filled with peace like she had never known before. And Much Afraid fell asleep, laying there on that altar. When Much Afraid woke up from her sleep, she was pleasantly surprised to look around and see the fog was gone, the sun was shining, and it was a beautiful place. There was no sign of her friends, Sorrow and Suffering, and there was no sign of her enemies either, which was a very good thing. Much Afraid got up and began walking around looking at all the beautiful flowers. The waterfall was just beautiful and gorgeous, and there at the foot of the waterfall was a sparkling pool. Oh, it was so beautiful. Much Afraid couldn't resist. She went over to it and stepped carefully into the water. It felt as if life were just flowing all around her feet. And when she got out, she looked down at her feet. What do you think she saw? Her feet were beautiful. Much Afraid hurried back over to the water, and she got her face down close to the water, and she started splashing her face with the water. And then she went and looked for a small pool where the water was very still, and she found one that was as clear and still as a mirror. And what do you think she saw when she looked in it? Her mouth was no more crooked. It was beautiful. She had a beautiful straight smile. Oh, she was so joyful. The shepherd's promises had come true. Much Afraid had remembered the shepherd talking about the healing streams in the high places. And on the morning of the third day that Much Afraid was there, she woke up knowing that someone had called her. And she lay there quietly listening. She heard it again, only she didn't hear it with her ears. She heard it with her heart. Do you remember, boys and girls, how Much Afraid had that seed of love planted in her heart? Well, it had been growing for all this journey, and now she knew that that love was blooming in her heart, and she heard the shepherd's call in her heart. It was a call of love to come to him, to the high places. Much Afraid was wondering how she was going to get out of this canyon. The walls were very steep and rocky. And just then she saw the Hart and Hind. Maybe it was the same one she had seen climbing up Mount Injury, showing her the way. But this time she knew exactly what to do. She went leaping over to the wall with her straight feet. She just went bounding, leaping up that rocky canyon wall, just like the deer had done. She got to the top so quickly. Much Afraid saw the shepherd standing there waiting for her. But he did not look like a shepherd any longer. He looked like the king, because that's who the shepherd really was, the king. He was waiting for her, holding out his hands to her. He said, "Hey, you with the hind feet, get on over here." And she ran over to him and fell down at his feet. "At last you're here, Much Afraid. I am so happy that you have made it. And now it is time for me to give you a new name. You will no longer be called Much Afraid. From now on, you are going to be called Grace and Glory." Grace, boys and girls, is something that God gives us that we don't deserve. None of us deserve the love and forgiveness that the shepherd has for us, or the wonderful blessings that he gives to us. But grace is that beautiful gift that God gives us because he loves us and because he wants us to love him back. That is what grace in her new name meant. The glory is the presence of God living in us and through us. And so her new name, Grace and Glory, represented the new life that she was going to be living in the high places following the shepherd. The shepherd said, "Now, Grace and Glory, I want you to give me the bag of stones that you have been carrying with you on this journey." Much Afraid pulled out her bag and handed it to the shepherd. Took the bag, turned it upside down, and began to pour it out. And instead of the stones, out came beautiful jewels. I don't have a lot of beautiful jewels, so we have to pretend here, okay? Beautiful jewels! Much Afraid was shocked. The king took each one of these very precious jewels, and he took a little headband, and he began placing each stone in that headband. She was going to be forever wearing this beautiful crown upon her head with the lessons that she had learned that had now become precious jewels. What a great reminder of all the things she had learned that the shepherd had taught her. While the king was putting the jewels in Grace and Glory's crown, she was thinking about her helpers, wondering where they were. And the shepherd said, "Grace and Glory, I have some new helpers for you." And she said, "Oh, King, I was hoping that I could have my friends Sorrow and Suffering." And he just said, "Well, here are your new helpers." And out came these two beautiful, tall, strong ladies. Grace and Glory looked at them, and she went over to them and said, "Who are you? What are your names?" And they looked at each other, and then they looked back at Much Afraid, and instead of saying anything, they reached out their hands like they were going to take hold of Grace and Glory's hand. Grace and Glory said, "I know you! I know who you are! You're Sorrow and Suffering!" And they said, "Oh, no, we're not. We are no more sorrow and suffering than you are, Much Afraid. Don't you know that sorrow and suffering cannot enter the kingdom of love? But you brought us here with you, and now we are joy and peace." The high places where Grace and Glory and joy and peace were was not the highest of the mountains. There were some that reached further up, so high up into the heavens that you couldn't even see the tops of them. Those were the high places where the king's servants went when they were done serving him on the earth. But for this moment in time, Grace and Glory and joy and peace went with the king, leaping over the rocks and mountains, and oh, they were having such a lovely time together, and the king was careful not to go too fast for them because he was training them how to use their new feet that were not crippled anymore. One afternoon, Grace and Glory said, "Wait, Shepherd, I need to rest. I guess even Hind's feet need to rest sometime." They sat down on the rocks, laughing they were having such a good time. And the king said, "Grace and Glory, do you know how I was able to make your feet like Hind's feet and to bring you to the high places?" And she said, "No, my king, how about if you tell me?" Think back over the journey you've made, Grace and Glory. Think about the lessons you've learned. And so Grace and Glory began to think. She remembered her home in the valley and how the shepherd had called her to follow him. She remembered meeting sorrow and suffering and traveling through the desert and walking along the shores of loneliness and climbing Mount Injury. She remembered going through the forest of danger and tribulation and finally jumping off the canyon of full surrender. She said, "Well, my Lord, I will tell you what I learned. First, I learned that I must accept with joy every path that you lead me down and everything that you allow to happen to me. Even if I don't feel like going down that path, even if I don't like it, I still need to accept it with joy." He nodded, but didn't say anything. And then she said, "And I learned that when others hurt me, I must be bearing with love and choose to forgive, even if I don't feel like it. That is when God has the power to bring something good out of something bad." He nodded at her and smiled. And she said, "And then I learned that you never looked at me as I was, a weak, crippled, fearful little, much afraid. You saw me as I would be when you'd done what you had promised. You always treated me as a daughter of the king. You know, Shepherd, I want to treat others the way you have treated me." The fourth thing was, I learned that everything that happens in life, no matter how crooked or crippled or ugly something is, it can be changed if I choose to love, forgive, and obey. King, I think that you let us meet with the bad and wrong things that you want changed. Maybe that's why we're in this world. You want the sorrow and suffering, the ugly and wrong things to be made into something beautiful. You want us to overcome evil with good. At last he spoke and he said, "You have learned well, Grace and Glory. It's because you learned those lessons so well that I was able to change your crippled feet into Hind's feet. I want you to remember, Grace and Glory, as long as you are acceptance with joy and bearing with love, you can never become crippled again. So now I want you to use your hind feet and follow me." And off he went, leaping and bounding, and Grace and Glory and joy and peace followed him up into a beautiful meadow high up in the mountains. One day Grace and Glory came to the edge of the high places, and she began to look down across the low places. She could see the desert, she could see the shores of loneliness, and there off in the distance was a village. And as she looked closer, she began to be able to make out certain places in that village. And she realized that was the village of much trembling where she used to live. She began to think about all of the people who lived there. She remembered Mrs. Valiant, how she had come to help her and rescue her. She was so thankful for Mrs. Valiant, and she was thinking, I hope someday I can be like Mrs. Valiant. And then she remembered her fearing relatives. And you know, it was quite obvious to her that the king had changed her heart, because all of a sudden she loved them. She cared about them. She began thinking how much they needed the shepherd, how much they needed to come to the high places and be changed like she had. The king happened to come along right at that moment in time, and she said, "Oh, my king, I was just thinking about my relatives. You know, they need you so badly. If you can change me into grace and glory, surely you can change them. What can we do, shepherd?" He said, "Grace and glory, there is nothing I would like more than to be able to change them. But you see, they don't love me. In fact, they hate me. I am not welcome in their home." He said, "I need someone who will speak to them for me." Grace and Glory thought, "I could do that," she said. The shepherd said, "Do you think they would listen to you?" She said, "Well, maybe not at first. I wasn't very nice to them before. But I could go back into the valley, and they could see how much I've changed because of your love that has changed my heart. And they'll be able to see that I'm not crippled anymore. And maybe they will begin to want to be changed as well." And the shepherd was so happy and joyful, because that is one of the main reasons he had brought Grace and Glory to the high places. Grace and Glory became aware of the sound of the waterfall, and as she listened to its words, she finally understood. "Come, oh come away, lower and lower every day. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below, always answering to the call to the lowest place of all." Grace and Glory was now ready to be like that water and go pouring from the high places back down into the valley, where she would be able to tell her fearing relatives about the shepherd king and how much he loved them. Well, boys and girls, I am so glad that you have listened to the story of Much Afraid becoming Grace and Glory. This journey she was on is a journey that you and I will be going on as well, as we walk with our shepherd and as we allow him to change our hearts from fear to love, from hate to love, well, it's really all about love, isn't it? His name is love. And so, thank you for watching. I love you, and we'll see you again on another Story Time with Nonie. Bye-bye.